All right, good morning. This is NTI Day 26, the notes for NTI Day 26. And we're going to be talking about John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier. Kennedy was only president for about 3 years, but he had a huge impact, and a lot of things were going on during his time as president. So we're going to go over some of those things today. Normally, I split this up over 2 days, but I'm going to try to go through it fast enough that we don't spend a whole lot of time. You don't spend a whole lot of time watching this video, but we'll go through Kennedy. In 1960, Eisenhower's second term as president is ending. Okay, and the Cold War is going to heat up there towards the end. All right, and the presidential election was a big one. John F. Kennedy, a young Democrat, was running against Richard Nixon, who had been Eisenhower's vice president. Kennedy argued that we had to be friends with these other countries, Latin American countries, Asian, African countries, to combat communism. He pledged to get America into the space race. He created NASA. He's going to, he says we're going to get a man on the moon before the end of the decade. He believes in voluntarism, which is, young people going to other countries to help modernize them, basically on a volunteer basis, not getting paid, just, whatever it takes to live over there. Nixon is much more experienced. He's been preparing for this for years and years. He's a respected foreign statesman, and he has this track record of fighting communism already, because he was the guy who had Alger Hiss basically found guilty of being a spy, even though there wasn't very much evidence. Okay, this election had a couple of firsts in it. The major one was, this was the first time a presidential debate was televised in history. Any other time it had been heard on the radio, or you'd had to have been there in person or read about it in a newspaper. And Nixon was sick when they had this debate. He looked kind of pale and weak and sweaty. He refused to wear makeup. And so, everybody on television wears makeup, because if you don't, then you look like Nixon did on that night. Kennedy did wear makeup. He looked cool and collected. A lot of people thought he was handsome. And after the debates, his popularity shot right up through the roof. One of the weird things about it was people who watched on television felt Kennedy won. People who listened on the radio thought Nixon won the debate, because they couldn't see how pale and sweaty and sick he looked. Okay, so this just proves the point that, your image, the way you look, is very, very important. Because Kennedy was younger, he looked confident, he was handsome, he wasn't all pale and sweaty. People naturally gravitated towards him, while Nixon looked like he was uncomfortable and sick, and that turned people off. And so this is going to be big going forward. People just start to realize the power of television and how calm and cool and collected you are. Kennedy's going to win. It's pretty close, but Kennedy does defeat Nixon, and this makes Nixon a bitter, angry man. All right, but Kennedy said something very, very profound that has stuck with a lot of people for a long time afterwards, and it's one of the most famous things he said. And so on his inauguration, he kind of ends it by saying, "And so, my fellow Americans, I ask not what you can do for your country. Sorry. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And that is a something that a lot of people have repeated over the last 60 years, because it had a big impact on people at that time and moving forward. So people kind of looked at Kennedy and his wife, Jackie Kennedy, and his young children, and kind of looked at them like, this is America. This is this perfect American family. He's young and good looking. His wife's young and good looking. They got young little children. And people basically kind of looked at them like they did the British royal family. And they nicknamed this 3-year time period Camelot. Okay, but Kennedy's time as president is going to be anything but fairy tale. He's got a lot of problems to deal with. One of those is Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows Batista in a revolution and sets up a communist country in Cuba. Now, this is important because Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida. So all of the communist countries have been in Europe or Asia so far. Now there's one right next door. When Kennedy came into office, there was already a plan under Eisenhower to try to overthrow Castro in Cuba. And basically, what we were going to do is we were going to train Cubans to invade and overthrow Castro and the government, to kill him. All right? And so Kennedy said, yeah, okay, go, without really knowing much about it. Well, this is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was a complete disaster. The ships got stuck. The weapons we gave them were old and didn't really work. The Cuban military was there waiting for them when they arrived on the beach. And all this did was make Kennedy look like he didn't know what he was doing, and made Castro even more popular in Cuba and in other Latin American countries, because America had kind of been bossing everybody around in North and South America for a while, and so they liked it when we when we made them look bad. And so a lot of pressure is going to come on Kennedy pretty early. Nikita Khrushchev, who's the head of the Soviet Union now because Stalin has died in 1956, he tried to bully Kennedy. He sent in troops and denied access to East Berlin. Kennedy called in the Army Reserve and the National Guard units to go there, and Khrushchev backed down, but then they built the Berlin Wall, which is a whole nother issue. But Kennedy doesn't let Khrushchev bully him. Another thing is Kennedy basically goes on television and apologizes, which really ups his credibility in America, because a lot of times when you make a mistake, you blame it on somebody else. Kennedy took full responsibility. He ordered it, but the plan was terrible. It was the CIA's plan and Eisenhower's plan, but he still took responsibility. He didn't blame anybody else. Up next is another problem with Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We basically had spy planes flying around over Cuba, and they photographed the Cubans building nuclear missile silos, because the Soviet Union was going to send over nuclear missiles to Cuba so they could have them very close to the United States. Kennedy goes on television and announces this to the American people and tells them our plan, which was to quarantine Cuba, surround it by naval ships, and not allow those nukes to reach it to Cuba. Okay, so what was happening was Soviet ships, warships, were heading towards Cuba. American warships were in their way. And so people were basically terrified that nuclear war was going to break out. There were about 13 days, people were going crazy. You think like there's shortages at Walmart and stuff now, like there were shortages at grocery stores everywhere. People were buying nuclear bomb shelters and putting them in their backyards, digging holes and putting them in their backyards because they thought that the end of the world was coming. All right, but Kennedy and Khrushchev talk it out. They don't make any rash decisions and basically come to an agreement that will make the Soviet Union look good and make America look good. All right, and so the Soviets turn the ships around and send them back to Russia, which to the Americans, hey, we won. This is what we wanted. We got what we wanted. But Khrushchev goes back because Kennedy promised to take American nuclear weapons out of Turkey, which is right next to the Soviet Union. So he can say, look, we scared them. I got them to remove their nuclear weapons from Turkey. So the Soviets are happy. All right, we also promised not to invade Cuba again. All right, so basically both sides got what they wanted and everybody else got what they wanted to because no thermonuclear war and the end of the world. Okay. Another issue that Kennedy had to deal with was the problems in Vietnam. Vietnam was fighting between communists and democratic forces, and we were basically going to support the democratic side. Now, we weren't at war yet, but Kennedy begins sending troops and military leaders to advise and help the communists. Our troops are not fighting yet. One of the big problems with all this was that the South Korean leader was hated. His name was No Din Diem, and we're sitting there supporting him. So the Vietnamese people did not like him. And because we supported him, they did not like the Americans either. They would much rather have had a Vietnamese leader. His name is going to be Ho Chi Minh, and he's the communist leader of Vietnam. And so the Vietnamese don't even really want us there. And just to show you how unpopular Diem was, if you look, there's a slide of a Buddhist monk or Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire in protest of No Din Diem's rule. Now, you might not like Donald Trump, you might not have liked Barack Obama, but nobody was out in the streets lighting themselves on fire and burning themselves to death in protest. Okay, so how bad does something have to be before you would go out and light yourself on fire to protest it? I know some people, Corey, lit their face on fire last year, but he didn't do that on purpose. So, it had to have been bad for people to have done that. So Kennedy is going to basically order the assassination of Diem because things are so bad. And that is going to basically lock America into this war. We kill the president of South Vietnam. Now we're left in charge. Okay, and that's going to get us involved more. There were a lot of civil rights issues going on in the early 60s. There's the famous sit-in at Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina. African-American groups went around and basically would peacefully protest against segregation and different issues that were plaguing our country, especially in the South. 1962, James Meredith, a U.S. Army veteran and black student, enrolled at the University of Mississippi. The governor wouldn't let him in, so Kennedy had to send troops to force the university to allow him to register. There's going to be like violence, fires and stuff break out on campus in protest of this, all going to be broadcast on the news. And the Army basically had to stay there to protect him throughout the rest of the semester. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to launch a bunch of demonstrations, peaceful protests in Alabama, and these people are attacked by dogs. Tear gas is used on them. They're going to be sprayed with fire hoses, which is very powerful, could tear the skin off your body. They were zapped with electric cattle prods. All this going on television, coming into your house every evening, which is basically going to anger a lot of people outside of the South. And Kennedy is one of them. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be arrested. One of his, famous quotes from his letter from a Birmingham jail was, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider." Okay, so he's got some very strong words for what's going on, and Kennedy listens to this and actually becomes a pretty big supporter of the civil rights movement. If you've seen Forrest Gump, you've seen the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, try to block African American students from enrolling there. Medgar Evers, who is a civil rights activist and a World War II veteran, is shot and killed in Mississippi in 1963. So things are not going well. But in September of 63, a bomb blows up at a black church in Birmingham, killing 4 young black girls. And after that, Kennedy takes his personal feelings public. And he tells the country that racial discrimination has no place in American life or in the law. And so he moves to start tearing down racial discrimination, Jim Crow laws, things like that in the South. Okay, so this is in September of 63. Okay, he's going to end segregation in public buildings and things like that, protect black voters. Well, about a month later, he goes to Dallas, Texas. He's campaigning for re-election. And he's shot and killed while riding in a convertible through downtown Dallas. He was shot in the head and the throat and died almost immediately. And there's film of this actually happening, this Zapruder Films. Lee Harvey Oswald, the ex-Marine, is arrested a few hours later. He matched the description of someone who was seen leaving the book depository, a book warehouse, shortly after Kennedy was shot. That's where a rifle and shell casings were found. He shot and killed an off-duty police officer who stopped him to question him. He went and hid in a movie theater, and that's where he was picked up. While Kennedy's body was being flown back to Washington, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, takes the oath of office. Okay, and just a few days later, Lee Harvey Oswald was being transported to another jail. He was in a little local jail. They wanted to take him somewhere a little more safe. And he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, while cameras and television cameras were there and rolling and caught the whole thing. All right, there's a lot of conspiracy theories. If you look on the last slide, it's a couple of photographs. There's all these conspiracy theories about there's a second shooter, somebody on the grassy knoll, who was behind all this. Um, Ruby was a low-level enforcer for the mob and had cancer. And so him killing Oswald made people think maybe the mob is behind it. Because he had nothing to lose. He was going to die of cancer. He worked for the mob. He's going to do the mob a favor and wipe him out. There are some people who think the CIA did it. There are some people who think aliens did it. There's some people think that the Vietnamese did it. There's some people who think that the Russians did it. There's some people who think that the Cubans did it. There's some people think that white supremacist groups did it. That there's all kinds of theories. There are a lot of people who are angry at Kennedy. But with him died, this idea of hope and promise that he had helped grow during his presidency. So there's some questions I have for you. Number one, what was what aided Kennedy in getting himself elected? Number two, I want you to describe his dealings with what happened in Cuba. And number three, I want you to do a little research on these conspiracy theories about him. And I want you to tell me which one you think is the most plausible, which one you think is the most likely to be the cause of his death, who was behind it, I guess. All right? And tell me a little bit about why you think that. I think Sophia will really like this because she likes conspiracy theories. And also, if you Google similarities between Lincoln and Kennedy's assassination, you're going to find a lot of interesting things. So I just ask that you do that maybe for fun after you answer these questions. All right, we only have one more set of notes to do, and I'll have that put up here in a couple of days, or it'll be up by the time you're ready for it. All right, so good luck and have a good day.